My name is Tom Donnelly, and I am the chief scholar here at the National Constitution Center and also a law professor at the University of Richmond. And I'm delighted to be here to talk to you and to celebrate Black History Month, where in today's conversation, we're going to explore a powerful through line in American history, how African Americans have invoked the principles of the Declaration of Independence to push for a freer and more equal America. And to discuss this tradition, its enduring relevance, I really can't think of two better speakers to have with us today. We have Lucas Morel, who is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and head of the Politics Department of Washington and Lee University, a leading scholar of the American founding and Abraham Lincoln. He is the author and editor of numerous books, including Lincoln and the American Founding. He currently serves on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission. And then we have Melvin Rogers, who is the Edna and Richard Solomon Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brown University and a leading scholar of democratic theory and African-American political thought. He is the author of the magnificent book, The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African-American Political Thought, which we featured in an earlier town hall, and his work has appeared in major academic journals and various popular outlets, including The Atlantic and the Boston Review. Lucas, Melvin, thank you so much for joining us again.
Delighted to be here.
Glad to be a part.
And maybe, Lucas, I'll start with you. And this obviously could be the topic of an entire town hall, but maybe just place on the table for us briefly what you would take to be some of the core principles that we find in the Declaration of Independence.
Sure. These are principles that are tidily distilled in the second sentence of the Declaration, which is the beginning of the second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, right? So the principle of equality, and part of that is equality in their natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the things you have even before government shows up or has something to do. But once you know that people are rights-bearing entities or beings, these are not self-enforcing rights, and therefore you need government not to give you these natural rights because you have them by nature, you're born with them. You need government to secure, using the language of the Declaration, to secure these rights, deriving their just powers by the consent of the governed. If nobody can rule you without your permission, or if you're the natural born ruler of yourself, shall we say, then only rule by permission or by consent is legitimate rule. So those are what I see are the central tenets of the American founding. And of course, if government isn't acting appropriately, then inherent in those rights is the right to revolution, or right to alter and abolish those forms and to create forms of government that would secure your safety and happiness.
Excellent. Thank you for that summary, Lucas. You know, Melvin, both you and Lucas were part of this super interesting project we had at the Constitution Center as part of our interactive Declaration of Independence, where you came together with other scholars and identified a list of 10 sources across American history that drew on the Declaration of Independence to push for different visions of change. And, you know, with that, we see the through line that across history, different groups have laid claim to the principles in the Declaration of Independence to try to create, you know, in their view, a better America. As we think about the principles that Lucas already placed on the table, you want to talk a little bit about, you know, why the Declaration has, you know, in a broad sense, we'll be more specific later, but in a broad sense, this sort of propulsive and important force throughout American history.
Yeah, Thomas, thanks for that. I mean, I think that sort of propulsive force is captured in the very beginning of that second paragraph, as Lucas said, but not in the principles that are outlined there, but in the very beginning, we hold these truths. This language of we hold is about maintaining. It is about how do we remain committed? It is about ongoing work. And so African Americans have seen in that language resources to push and prod the nation toward the values that seem and that were, in fact, insecurely held. If we think about the fact of slavery, if we think about practices of oppression and the like. And so those sort of first set of words we hold are words that encourage us to be reminded of the question, how will we maintain our commitment to these principles? And African Americans have often worked to try to call their white counterparts to the nobility of those principles.
Excellent. I mean, and Lucas, we obviously see this from the very beginning of American history. With the Declaration, its core principles, that powerful language, as Melvin said, we hold, inspiring those battling slavery from the very beginning. And we think of Prince Hall, we think of Benjamin Franklin's last public act, his petition to Congress on behalf of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. Can you talk a little bit about the role the Declaration plays in those early fights against
Sure.
the institution of slavery?
Yeah, and one thing as devoted as I am to the Declaration, because I am a student of Lincoln, and I think he's the greatest student of the Jefferson, the Declaration, and the founding. As beholden as I am to the Declaration of Independence, one thing to keep in mind is the Declaration of Independence, which was signed was authorized July 4th, 1776. They spent the balance of the summer signing it. But the Declaration was expressing something that was already in the air, as it were. I mean, you have slave petitions prior to the Declaration of Independence speaking in the language of two things, the Enlightenment and the Bible. And so, one of the tropes, an early trope of the abolitionists was the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, right? So that's from the Bible. That's revealed truth about human beings, regardless of color, race, sex, all bearing the image of God, the imago Dei, as we say. And that flows right into the expression of the Declaration, which isn't just a product of the Enlightenment, but it's a certainly key element of the Declaration. But suffice it to say, people were already using, as it were, the language of the Enlightenment to express truths from the Bible. And so you have this kind of natural and revealed truths being expressed by, formally by white males in Independence Hall. But you also have it being spoken as part of the lingua franca, just kind of the conversations of even the most oppressed people on American soil. So black slaves, who you would think would be, not even the lowest face on the totem pole, they're under the ground, right? They are so no protection, no status whatsoever. Even those even who are illiterate, and many were literate, but even those who were illiterate knew that they possessed rights as they heard neighbors talking about what it is that human beings possess simply by being human beings. So, for example, one of the authors we have to discuss today is this one named Lemuel Haynes, and who's a black man. His mother was white, his father was black. Grew up essentially as an indentured servant. He was orphaned as a child. He writes this extremely erudite and sophisticated argument titled Liberty Further Extended. And the preface is a direct quote it's the second line of the Declaration. We hold these truths. And so what you see in this document, and we only have a portion of it, is someone who's talking about both natural rights and God-given rights. He uses the Declaration because he knows that's important to the whites who are in control. They're like, look, you said this. I'm just reading it back to you. As Melvin mentioned, do you really believe it? And if so, and his principal critique here was of the slave trade. And of course, you don't critique the slave trade and unless you think slavery is wrong. And so the Declaration, along with the Bible, I would argue, is what you see left, right, and center, even before the Declaration distills it in those famous words.
Yeah, and maybe I'll give a little flavor of Lemuel Haynes from the excerpt we have. And I think it brings out exactly what you're suggesting, Lucas, sort of this declaration and these speakers bringing together the influence of the Enlightenment, the influence of the Bible. And here's Lemuel Haynes. As all are of one species, so there are the same laws and aspiring principles placed in all nations. And the effect of these laws will produce are similar to each other. Consequently, we may suppose that what is precious to one man is precious to another. What is irksome or intolerable to one man is so to another, considered in a law of nature. Therefore, we may reasonably conclude that liberty is equally as precious to the black man as it is to the white one, and bondage equally as intolerable to the one as to the other. Those privileges that are granted to us by the divine being, no one has the least right to take them from us without our consent. So going back to consent, which you flagged at the beginning, and there is not the least precept or practice in the sacred scriptures that constitutes a black man a slave any more than a white one. So maybe to bring you in, Melvin, if you have any reflections on Haynes, who is, our source from the Interactive Declaration, love to hear any thoughts there, or if there are additional voices or strands in this early anti-slavery and abolitionist thought that think you're useful to place on the table. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, I mean it's an exceptional essay. So it's written in 1776, shortly after the Declaration of Independence. It's not discovered until 1983 by Ruth Boggin, and it was discovered in an archive at Harvard University. And so a major track to find. And at the core of it, the title of it is Liberty Further Extended. Further extended. So somehow we're coming up short, right? According to Haynes. And part of what he is saying is that if liberty is real, it can admit of no exceptions. Slavery cannot be the exception. And if liberty allows exception, it will not remain liberty for very long. And so part of what Haynes is doing, and others downstream, as we'll talk about them, part of what Haynes is doing is calling his white counterparts to accountability, right? If in fact you are so committed to this, then the entailment of it, both from the Declaration of Independence and both from the perspective of being Christians, as you all claim you are, the entailment is that you resist, that you abolish, that you fight against the enslavement of fellow human beings. And I think it's important to say fellow human beings for Haynes is because for him, color is meaningless. By that I mean color should have no bearing on the recognition of one's moral and therefore legal status.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I mean, that places, so many elements of the Declaration on the table that are then picked up in antebellum America, where we see, the Declaration of Independence. It's going to continue to be an important part of the debates over slavery that take place all the way in the run-up to the Civil War. The Declaration of Independence itself, a key source for anti-slavery and abolitionist voices all throughout this period, building from the tradition of Lemuel Haynes and onward. That brings us to our next source from the Interactive Declaration, which is David Walker's appeal, which Frederick Douglass would later describe as, quote, startling the land like a trump of coming judgment, which is a very powerful statement from Douglass. Maybe to quickly bring you back in, Melvin, maybe tell us a little bit about, who was David Walker and, what is the context for this appeal?
Right. So David Walker, he's born in 1796 to an enslaved father and to a free mother. And given the sort of legal codes, his status follows that of his mother. So he's free. He's in the South, and he slowly makes his way to the North and settles in Boston. And it's in Boston. He was a used clothes dealer selling used clothes, but he was also an intellectual and trying to figure out sort of how to strike a blow against the enslavement of Black people. And so he wrote this treatise in 1829, a pamphlet, and it traveled south along the eastern seaboard, and it made it as far west as Louisiana, and it generated a great deal of ire by white politicians, mayors, and governors. And part of what Walker is trying to do there is that if Haynes was in some way speaking to his white counterparts, Walker is really talking to his Black counterparts. What are you to do in the face of domination? What does freedom call you to do? And part of what he's saying, this is a point that Lucas made early on, part of what he's saying is that, look, these rights, even though they are given to us by nature, they are not self-executing. In order for them to show themselves in the world, you have to act in the light of them, right? So liberty, even though you're naturally endowed with it, it comes into the world by virtue of you acting. And in the face of domination, if you claim yourself to be free, then you must resist it at all costs. And he says at the very beginning of that pamphlet, we only have a small a portion of this, but he says at the very beginning of the pamphlet that every man, woman, and child should read this pamphlet or have it read to them so that they can understand what their duties are with respect to themselves in the face of domination.
Love that. And Lucas, I'll bring you in on the substance. First, a little flavor from David Walker himself. Here's a piece of his appeal. I ask the attention of the world of mankind to the declaration of these very American people of the United States. Hear your language, proclaimed to the world. July 4th, 1776, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, all caps, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Compare your own language above, extracted from your Declaration of Independence, with your cruelties and murders inflicted by your cruel and unmerciful fathers, and yourselves on our fathers and on us, men who have never given your fathers or you the least provocation. Powerful words. Love to hear your thoughts, Lucas, on David Walker's appeal, some of his arguments, and its broader influence and power.
Yeah, what I like that's been highlighted there, especially by Melvin, is this idea that freedom has to begin with the person who is aggrieved. In other words, you don't wait for the obstacles to your liberty, to your agency, to then exercise your liberty and agency. And this is a strong theme, a consistent theme for Frederick Douglass. So both of them are seizing on something that they themselves lived. Here are guys who are preaching what they have already practiced, right? Frederick Douglass, who I'm pretty sure we're going to pivot to pretty quickly. Here's a guy who didn't wait for his enslavement to end, because that was not going to happen. He had to take it into his own hands with the assistance of some important people. But this was his message, especially to blacks on American soil. He said, should our oppressors stop oppressing us and remove the obstacles to our freedom? Absolutely. Do we wait for them to do so? No. And in fact, to wait is to reinforce in their minds the myth of white superiority, white supremacy. In other words, it reinforces something that's false, which is to think that the blacks are just naturally servile, passive, a secondary being among the species that are humans. Douglass said, no, you have to resist. You have to act like a free man to get your freedom. A great line from Byron. Got to pull it up here. I should have this memorized. Hereditary bondsmen, know ye not that he who would be free must cast the first blow. And so it's a way to tell your oppressor, here's one, I can argue the case, but I can also act the case. You got to be free, you got to act free.
Absolutely. And we'll bring in Douglass in just a moment. One more beat on Walker, and it connects to something you said at the beginning, Lucas, when you were laying out the principles of the Declaration. The last one that in that famous line is the right of revolution, one of the most important rights of all. And where Walker ends here is he says, hear your language further, but when a long train of abuses and usurpation pursuing invariable the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards of their future security. Now, Americans, I ask you candidly, was your sufferings under Great Britain 100th part as cruel and tyrannical as you have rendered ours under you? And it's sort of an amazing connection to the Declaration and public memory and the American Revolution. Walker able to bring that in as a critique that I think, as Melvin stressed at the beginning, it's a broad audience. It's among African Americans. It's going to have a wider circulation than that, but sort of the powerful right of revolution also framing the challenge here.
Right. I mean, he's quoting it back to Americans. And we'll see this later with King. All we ask is that you be true to what you said on paper, right? If you had rejected this, and there's a time when a small but large enough minority of white Americans are going to say, we don't like the American way as Lincoln and the Republicans understand it, we're going to start our own thing. There was a time when those principles were rejected, okay? But the impetus of anything that I see as progress and civil rights in this country had always been aligned with the most principled understanding and interpretation of the Declaration. And that includes it. I mean, this is a right that never goes away. The right of revolution, even when you establish a civil society, establish constitutional self-government, there is always that right. In other words, government can always, at a certain point in time, not just simply make mistakes, but act in a tyrannical fashion. and you don't need its permission to alter or abolish that government to produce your safety and happiness. And so Walker, Douglass, and others are just preaching from a hymnal that somebody else wrote, but they understood it to apply to them. And if you want a different hymnal, then we'll have a different conversation. But as long as you're beholden to the Declaration, as long as you're holding on to that, right, our revolutionary fathers, as everybody called them, he's like, okay, let me remind you what they said and what they were willing to risk and do. The question becomes, that second paragraph talks about the right of revolution. It also talks about prudence. In other words, is that right a right that should be exercised in a suicidal fashion? Okay, so I mean, do we want to be Samson? I'm not so sure, right? That's something that I think we need to factor in as well. That you may have a right, and as foundational and radical as a right of revolution, the question is, well, when ought one to exercise that right? For Frederick Douglass, we'll see, he even though he was aware with what John Brown was planning in then Virginia, Douglass said this is not the way to go. This isn't the time to excite a revolution among the enslaved.
So I think there's just two quick points to make about this thread of the exchange. The first is that Walker is mainly speaking to African Americans, but he knows that he will have white readers. This was reviewed in William Lord Garrison's Liberator and discussed. He knows that they are over his shoulder listening, right? And so part of what Walker is saying is that you yourself recognize that when you were under the thumb of monarchical power, that in order to be true to your liberty, it required you to revolt. How could you possibly not see that we're inclined to do the same? And so if you don't transform, then you know what will follow, because that was your response to monarchical power. I think the second thing worth saying about this discussion, and very important for the listeners to understand, is that you have these folks appealing to the Declaration and using the Declaration, and it's because they believe that they're speaking to an audience that perceive themselves to be bound by it, even if they're not clear about the entailments. That is to say, they believe that they belong to a society that is responsible to a moral horizon that binds and directs them. And so they actually think that they can be persuasive in shaming the audience and calling them to the red carpet. And in truth, there's no way to make sense of the abolitionist movement apart from that thought. And I think that that's very important, that if you come to belong to a society that no longer holds dear its foundational principles, then these kinds of appeals will be very difficult to get off the ground. That was not the case in 1829.
So interesting. No, that's great threads pulled there from Walker, and I think it's a great transition to our next source, which brings us to 1852, and Lucas has already previewed it a bit by referencing Frederick Douglass, but the source figures Frederick Douglass. The source is what to the slave is the 4th of July. Maybe Melvin, if you can come in, maybe give us a sense of Frederick Douglass's place. He's obviously a familiar figure, but his place within the abolitionist movement at this time, and maybe a bit about the context for the speech that he's giving right here.
Yeah, I mean, this is, Douglass is a major figure in the context of abolitionism. In some ways, in 1852, he is the preeminent voice that is being consulted. There are others around him, most certainly. But the combination of his eloquence and his stature and his mind commands a respect above a great many other African American thinkers and activists at the time. This address, What to the Slave is 4th of July, is actually given in June, and is given in Rochester. And part of what Douglass is trying to do in the form of Haynes is to speak to his white counterparts and to speak to them about accountability. And he wants to do it in the context of the celebration of the 4th of July. He wants to do it in a way to say to his white counterparts, his listeners, have you earned? Have you earned the glory that you rightly attach to your founders? Right? Do you rise to the occasion, the moment of enslavement now, as they rose to the occasion against monarchical power? And if you have not, if you don't rise to that occasion, if you haven't risen to that occasion, right, is it right to sort of properly claim your inheritance from them? And in some ways, Douglass knows, he's rhetorically sophisticated in the classical sense of this. Douglass knows that his audience has a love affair with the founders. He knows that they want to be continuous, and he knows that they don't want to be out of step. And the rhetorician, as we know, always meets their audience where they stand with their bundle of commitments and passions and indeed loves. And that's where Douglass begins as a way to sort of stimulate a sense of shame in his audience with the hope that that will generate a kind of transformation.
Yeah, beginning with, a celebration of some of the achievements of the founders. And then there's that abrupt line, fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? And then, a little bit later, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. I will not enlarge further on your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. So maybe bring you in, Lucas. I see Frederick Douglass over your shoulder there. Maybe some reflections on this powerful speech and Douglass's larger role in the abolitionist movement.
Oh, yeah. This speech, David Blight, who's written the best biography, Prophet of Freedom, on Frederick Douglass, we won't need another one, in my opinion, for at least another generation, has referred to this as a 3-act symphony. It really has 2 major acts and then a closing coda, I would call it, but be that as it may. The first act is your typical eulogy. It's your typical July 4th speech. And he is all praise for the fathers. He's all praise for their principles, all praise for even them as people, right? Courage, they risked everything. They were brave men, et cetera, et cetera. Studiously avoids what everybody knows, which is that they held slaves, okay? He refers to Washington. Washington could not die without freeing his slaves. That's the one time he mentions slavery in the context of the founding. So he gives you this eulogy, kind of the traditional July 4th speech, and then says, but that's not why you invited me. You could have invited, anybody could have given that speech. Let me tell you what we should think about today in context, with that as our context, which is you call yourself sons. You're right. We have Abraham for our father. In America, the example is we have Washington for our father. So he borrows that from the New Testament. And he says, you don't look a thing like him. If you aren't risking the way they risked, if you aren't exercising bravery, if you aren't taking chances, if you aren't doing the things they did to bring those principles, which he called were saving principles, eternal principles. He makes a point in the early part of the speech that he's glad that it is a young republic. In other words, we haven't fully matured yet. And the reason for that is, as was pointed out, our national inconsistencies. We say one thing and we don't quite do it consistently, thoroughly. And then he's hammer and tong against the government, against the pulpit, the church, against political parties, all the ways in which people say one thing and do another. And so one thing I should remind us is this was a coming out speech for Douglass, because prior to the early 1850s, and this is dated 1852, Douglass was public, along with Garrison, is hating the Constitution. In 1847, when he comes back from his self-imposed exile to the United Kingdom, he comes back and he says, I think the Constitution should be shivered into 1,000 fragments. And for both Garrison, white abolitionist, and Douglass, a black abolitionist, it's the Declaration that points the way forward. And this speech is a coming out for Douglass, because in this speech, he finally publicly, in a major way, says, and he calls the Constitution, wait for it, if read in a particular way, if interpreted in a particular way, a glorious liberty document. It isn't simply a glorious liberty document to Douglass. It has to be read and interpreted in a certain way. And so for him, the way is through these saving eternal principles that the fathers got right, but imperfectly implemented. And now it's time for this generation to live up to them. Prove you're related to, the childless George Washington. Prove you're related to those forefathers who enunciated these great truths. I'll add one more point in terms of Douglass's place kind of in the abolition constellation. The British abolitionists loved Douglass because he wasn't just Garrison looking down as a white man and seeing, wow, slavery is awful. It's inconsistent with the Bible. It's inconsistent with the Declaration. Here you had somebody who was born into that institution, escaped, and now is speaking eloquently against it. They funded him. They paid for his manumission, the Brits across the pond. They gave him $2,000, which is a fortune back then, to start his own newspaper in late 1847, I think December of 1847. So you have now, as it were, competition for Garrison. And in 1852, finally, Douglass is on the side of those who think that the Constitution can be used as a leverage, as a mechanism to get rid of slavery, rather than reading it the way Garrison and John C. Calhoun read it, as a pro-slavery document.
And so I think that there are the 2 points, again, I think worth pulling out here, I think are quite important. The first, which Lucas outlined, which is the Constitution if read in a particular way. So now the Declaration functions as the moral compass to the Constitution. And if those things are sort of read in conjunction, then man-made law can be brought to the level of those laws, those God laws as stipulated in the Declaration. I think the second point, which is this thread that Lucas brought out about maturity. So it is very clear, Lincoln is going to press this, it is very clear to Americans that the rights stipulated in the Declaration are natural rights, but we don't always hold them properly. And we have to be educated to holding them properly. And so the fact of these rights, as we've said a couple of times, the fact that they are true, the fact that they are self-evident, the fact that they are God-given in no way means that they are self-executing. And in that question of how do they become executed, well, that has everything to do with us. That has everything to do with our moral maturity. And that goes back, and I'll conclude here, this is the third point actually, it goes back to, I think, the pursuit of happiness. We didn't say really much about that formulation, but one of the things that I think is worth pointing to is that happiness here is not considered, the kind of transient desires that we have that make us feel good. The pursuit of happiness is this long-term endeavor to cultivate ourselves in such a way that we are constantly meeting the demands of being free and being equal. Are we cultivating the kind of character and dispositions collectively, individually, to sustain the republic? Right? And I think that that's very important because it goes to how it is that these figures, or why it is these figures are constantly engaged in this kind of educative process of calling their fellows to the demands of these principles.
That's beautifully put, Melvin. And I think of Jeff Rosen's wonderful book on what the pursuit of happiness meant to the founders, very much resonating with what you're saying here, and what's influencing a figure like Frederick Douglass nearly a century later as he's giving this speech. And Melvin, you brought up in passing, the next key figure we're going to bring into the conversation, which is Abraham Lincoln. And it gets us to think of the connection between the advocacy of a figure like Frederick Douglass, and then the importance of the political project of Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Party, our nation's first major anti-slavery party that's going to secure the White House, and for Lincoln and a lot of his allies, the importance of the Declaration of Independence. Maybe, Melvin, I'll get to you, obviously, Lucas, in a second, because you've written such a wonderful book on Lincoln and America's founders. But maybe let Melvin place on the table for us sort of where Lincoln fits into this broader narrative, and in particular, the Gettysburg Address, the source that we have in the interactive Declaration of Independence.
Well, I mean, the Civil War and what sort of followed with the Civil War amendments really represents for many historians, many political theorists, I think they're right to think of it this way as the sort of second founding. And the Gettysburg Address, it comes in 1863. It's a dedication to the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Pennsylvania. If I didn't get that right, Lucas will correct me here. But Lincoln is trying to sort of figure out how do we go on in the wake of the Civil War? And part of what he's calling the nation to think about is, will these soldiers have died in vain? And of course, Lincoln is saying the ongoing work of perfecting the Union, of making this republic truer to its commitments, is the way we honor the death of those soldiers. And in putting it in that framework, it then sort of sets up these principles as ongoing work that attempts to redeem the death of these soldiers in the Civil War.
Love that. And Lucas, again, you wrote your wonderful book, Lincoln and the American Founding, and have thought so deeply about the influence of the founders and especially the Declaration of Independence on Abraham Lincoln's political thought, frankly, as political actions as well. Maybe give us a sense of how deeply that influenced Lincoln, how much that influenced the way in which he's framing the Gettysburg Address itself. I'd love to hear your reflections here on Lincoln's role in this story.
Yeah, absolutely devoted to the Declaration. He doesn't just quote it. Most often he quotes it verbatim when he's referring to the Declaration. But he also says en route to becoming president, at least getting to the inauguration, he stops in Philadelphia, stops at what we now call Independence Hall, and says, all the political sentiments I've ever held, I find, in the sentiments expressed in this building. And he's talking about the Declaration. He's not talking about the Constitution, even though he's going to be president to try to save the Constitution. So the Declaration was everything to Lincoln. And now I have to say, the Declaration was everything to most people in America. It all depended on your construction of it, in other words, how you construe or interpret it. And so Lincoln and the Republicans and abolitionists in particular interpreted as all meant all. Men was men and women. Consent was consent. If you're a human, you get everything, right? It was the equal humanity. And Lincoln was trying to do what he could among white Northerners. You got to remember, his audience wasn't white Southerners. He was not going to pull them back from the positive good thesis or defense of slavery. His chief audience were indifferent white Northerners, occupants, residents of free states and territories who were tempted to think that there was a racial basis for their rights and not a human basis. And so his chief, the chief threat to America wasn't John C. Calhoun, it was Stephen Douglass, who was teaching whites to be indifferent to what happens to black people out in the Western territories. And Lincoln said, no, it's in your own self-interest, you white people, to do the right thing by black people. Not, he wasn't going to go down the voting route yet. He wasn't promoting social, political, civil equality. Look, if we can't even agree that they're equal human beings, these other political objectives are fool's errands. So Lincoln was doing what he could to salvage this understanding that the basis of our rights, and even if it's ours as white people, the basis of our rights is not whiteness, it's humanness. You got to admit, even Southerners admit that the enslaved are human beings. And then there's a whole argument that he makes on that. So in the Gettysburg Address, coming back to what Melvin brought out, notice what he does with the equality principle. Lincoln ad nauseum says equality is a self-evident truth. In the Gettysburg Address, he calls it a proposition. Now, Lincoln is a student of Euclid. That was the most widely used, the first 6 books of Euclid are the most widely used geometry textbook in the United States. Lincoln was one term in Congress. What is he reading? Euclid's Elements. He's reading this book of geometry to train his mind, make his logic even more precise. And proposition is a term he borrowed from Euclid. Now, proposition is something that isn't self-evident. It has to be demonstrated. So what has to be demonstrated? Equality? No, what has to be demonstrated, and what Melvin pointed to was, are we capable as a people of living generation to generation according to this transcendent principle that recognizes the humanity of all other human beings around you and using that to drive political policy? And so that's why after the Civil War, after what Lincoln hopes is a successful war to preserve the Union, that's why that this war has to produce a new birth of freedom. Because remember, he delivers the Gettysburg Address in the year of Jubilee. It's November, but what happened back in January? The Emancipation Proclamation. And so Lincoln at that point and now says, hey, we are going to be a multiracial country, whether we like it or not. Notice he doesn't mention slaves, doesn't mention race in the Gettysburg Address, but everybody knows what he's talking about. And this new birth, what's going to be different? What's going to be different is we have to be more consistent in our practices with our profession. And that means the newly freed 3 to 4 million people, right? This will happen as a result of the 13th Amendment, as we know. But the Emancipation Proclamation declared the freedom of most enslaved Black people on American soil. And at that point in time, Lincoln is now envisioning a multiracial society. And so this freedom is theirs, it's their due, and we have got to find a way to live according to that principle.
And so, one of the things that's just striking here, very briefly, is that the war is not yet over.
No.
But Lincoln is thinking to himself, in the event this works out in our favor, how do I prepare the ground for this new America?
Mm-hmm.
And how do I create a moral context in which those that live in the wake of the Civil War, if this works in our favor, understand that their job is to constantly redeem what we've been doing, what this war has been about. And one of the things that I think is so striking about the Gettysburg Address is the aspirational quality of it, which is very much tied to what the principles are about. The principles of declaration are never held once and for all. We are always in the process of trying to discover what are the new demands that they place on us, given the political problems we find ourselves confronting. And Lincoln knows that a post-slavery America will present itself with a set of problems that were not anticipated. And so, are you going to meet the demand that freedom and equality and the pursuit of happiness places on you by constantly trying to sort of redeem what we've done today? And he makes that the test of what it means to be an American citizen committed to those values.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's a lovely way of putting it. And I mean, you've both done such a great job of, teeing up the next part of this story where the Union Army prevails in the Civil War. We do try our best at, Lucas, you mentioned the new birth of freedom, that image. The nation, ratifies a series of transformative amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. Melvin, as you suggest, many scholars, I think, rightly refer to this as America's second founding, and that there's a connection among those who are advocates of those amendments, especially the 14th Amendment, of the deep connection between the Declaration of Independence and what the Constitution's becoming after the Civil War. We have, in the campaign trail of 1866, Speaker of the House, Schuyler Colfax, on the campaign trail calling the 14th Amendment the gem of the Constitution. The reason why, because it's writing the Declaration of Independence into the Constitution's text. And so we have this inspiring moment of Reconstruction that is then, greeted with initially great success, but a series of setbacks culminating in the growth of Jim Crow by the end of the 19th century, which brings us to, our next key figure here, which is Ida B. Wells, who is such a key figure in the, both the late Reconstruction story into the transition to the 20th century. And maybe, Melvin, talk a little bit about, who Ida B. Wells was and where she fits into the story. Again, our source here is How Enfranchisement Stops Lynching from 1910, but she's such an important and powerful figure on many different dimensions.
No, Ida B. Wells is an extraordinary voice here, and we have to sort of acknowledge in the thread of the conversation we've been having. She's the first woman voice that we have. She's born in Mississippi in 1862, and she's freed at a very young age, and she grows up in a post-Civil War era. And she grows up in a post-Civil War era in which there are clear amendments on the books to protect African Americans and to support their right to participate in the polity. But this is also a time in which there is a great deal of resistance at local levels to Black people enjoying the rights that are now guaranteed to them by virtue of the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. And where Ida B. Wells shines most dramatically is in her response to the kind of terror that is exacted on Black people in the form of lynching. And so in 1895, we get her extraordinary red record. She is a journalist, and she is attempting to sort of reveal that the reasons that are often provided for why it is Black people are being lynched have nothing to do with their criminality. It has nothing to do with their involvement. It has everything to do with their race. And one of the things that I think is quite powerful with Ida B. Wells that she adds to this conversation. You know, look, I love Lincoln, I love Douglass, all of the figures that we've discussed. But Ida B. Wells is very forceful that unless the Constitution has teeth, unless the Declaration has teeth, its words are meaningless. And so her focus on the enfranchisement of Black people is basically to say, unless they can actively participate in the direction of this society in which they're located, unless they can participate in the construction of the laws that will govern them, there's no way for them then to protect. If they can't participate, they can't protect their freedom. They can't protect their equality, and they most certainly cannot engage in the pursuit of happiness. And so that the measure of one's commitment to Black freedom is found finally, she believes, in the laws and the people who are willing to protect those laws to defend Black freedom.
Yeah, and I'll bring you in, Lucas, here first, just a little bit from Ida B. Wells from the How Enfranchisement Stops Lynching. The flower of the 19th century civilization for the American people was the abolition of slavery and the enfranchisement of all manhood. Here, at last, was squaring of practice with precept, with true democracy, with the Declaration of Independence, and with the Golden Rule. The reproach and disgrace of the 20th century is that the whole of the American people have permitted a part to nullify this glorious achievement and make the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution playthings, a mockery and a byword, an absolute dead letter in the Constitution of the United States. So a disjunction between text and reality. Love to hear your reflections on Ida B. Wells.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add there. I thought Melvin summed that up pretty well. And I will say that with Ida B. Wells, we really see coming into fruition something that Frederick Douglass predicted. He said, with the coming of emancipation, the 13th Amendment, the successful conclusion of the war as a war to preserve the Union, Douglass said, unless we get the vote, we will simply have moved from a situation where the Black man is enslaved to an individual to the Black man enslaved to society. And so without suffrage, and there was a certain point where Douglass was, I mean, Melvin mentioned rhetoricians earlier. He is such a rhetorician. There was one point where he said, all we ask for is the vote and we'll take care of ourselves. In other words, we'll be able to defend ourselves. He said, we have to. That was how important he saw the vote for all the other rights to be secured. He says, we don't have the vote. The emancipation was a fraud. And he gives a speech more or less to that effect in the 1880s. So with Ida B. Wells, I just see her as the fruition of Douglass's prediction. As hopeful as he was for the 15th Amendment, it was immediately clear to him that's ink on paper. Unless Congress backs it up by federal teeth, as was mentioned earlier, if we put teeth, which is to say laws backed by a union, a federal army occupying the South, Blacks, the vast majority of whom live below the Mason-Dixon line, they're at the mercy of former oppressors.
Yeah, and I mean the other strand here, and Wells speaks of the 14th and 15th Amendment. She herself would be an important suffragist. And so
Oh
another key
yeah,
part of her legacy being the fight for women's suffrage
yeah,
culminating in the
and
ratification of the 19th.
Douglas was an early adopter on that. I
Exactly,
mean,
that
his
too. Yeah.
concession on the 15th Amendment was, look, half a loaf is better than nothing. And good grief, Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, I'm going to be kind here. They did not say nice things about Frederick Douglass. They said the opposite. And yes, they used racial epithets. They were so upset that any black person can vote, any black male could vote, and not a literate white woman couldn't. They didn't see the prudence in the 15th Amendment.
Yeah. No,
So
absolutely.
last point on Wells for me, and this line I just think is very important for us to understand. With no sacredness, and I'm reading here, with no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself. And
Mm.
I just want to be very clear on this point. We often think that if we just have the law, it's settled. I think this issue of sacredness, once again, it goes back to we hold. It is not just the existence of the law, but it is our relationship to it, such that the law has a kind of sacredness that if it is compromised, we are compromised. And so we fight for it. So there's always this toggle between institutional and legal transformation and the attempt to transform us to meet the new institution or the new law that is established, right? All of this is being guided by that moral compass, which is the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, lovely. Which brings us to our final source here, which is, in a way, it combines both a super famous person with a super famous speech here with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his I Have a Dream speech. Maybe starting with you, Melvin, you know, folks know about Dr. King, they know about this speech. Maybe give us a sense of where we are in sort of the history of the civil rights movement, sort of where are we on the timeline? What's happened leading up to this moment, and what's sort of still to be accomplished after King gives this speech?
Yeah, I mean, we're 63. So we're still a couple of years off from some major legal developments. King gives this speech as part of the March on Washington, which was concerned about poverty, right? This was sort of the context of the March on Washington, and King once again. I think what's important here, King once again, like the other figures, is very much aware of the love affair that Americans have with the founding. And so the I Have a Dream speech, which can sometimes be quite cliche, because that's the one we go to very frequently, because it seems to sort of speak very glowingly about what is possible. But that is what King meant to do, because he was trying to call his listeners to action, and call them to uphold again what they've always claimed themselves to be committed to. So that's sort of some of the context, and that's some of what King is trying to do in the I Have a Dream speech.
That's great. Thank you for that, Melvin. And here's just one key passage that quite famous, obviously. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So bring you in here, Lucas, to give some reflections here on Dr. King, the I Have a Dream speech, and its connection to what we've been saying about the power of the founders' principles and the Declaration of Independence.
Sure. I mentioned earlier, foreshadowing this part of our discussion, King's famous statement where he says, "All we ask is that you be true to what you said on paper."
Yeah.
Had previous generations rejected that paper, the Constitution and the Declaration, and adopted it, like Confederate Constitution was a very different document than the U.S. Constitution and made explicit Negro slavery, quote unquote. It made explicit its rejection of the Declaration principles, as all the authors that we mentioned so far. So King comes in from a long line of people who were appealing again both to the Bible and to Enlightenment principles that we find in the Declaration of Independence. So with King, being true to what you said on paper means taking what we said on paper seriously and therefore applying it to everyone. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was originally planned. Those speeches were supposed to be held at the steps of the Capitol because they wanted law. They wanted this, what will become known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. So when they're there August 28th, 1963, they originally planned to set up camp at the Capitol building because that's where the laws are made in the country. They shifted where? To the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and then used that as the touchstone for saying, is the black man in America truly free, right? In the shadow of Lincoln, 90 years later, right? For, whatever the math is for Martin Luther King Jr. And so, again, what he's doing is preaching to the nation from its own hymnal. The second time he mentions the Declaration in the I Have a Dream speech, he shifts from a dream to a creed. Okay, and so the line is to live out the true meaning of its creed, and then he quotes it. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And so that equality was supposed to mean something. That promissory note, as he referred to the Constitution and the Declaration earlier in that speech, it's supposed to mean something in the day-to-day lives of every American citizen. Are all Americans truly practically included in this thing we refer to as the American dream, which of course people don't want to remain a dream. They want it to be a reality. That's the point. If not for me, for my kids, that sort of thing. And so King, like many of the figures we quoted earlier, tapped into the major cultural and political streams of American social and political life. And so that's the Constitution and the Declaration, especially the Declaration, and it's the Bible. I mean, it's no coincidence that King is a preacher. It's no coincidence that King, ironically enough, in a speech devoted to freedom, he closes with an allusion to what we used to refer to as Negro spirituals. Those are slave songs by the enslaved on American soil of a future that they can envision for themselves because they're human beings and because of the very claims of white Americans at that time of what all human beings deserve. And so the reason why we come to King so often, why we come to this speech so often, is precisely because it was a moment in the long history of civil rights in this country, the civil rights struggle, excuse me. We come to King because, good night. How long ago was the Civil War from 1963? And this is still a problem. Race is still a problem. It shouldn't be. It's certainly not according to the founding documents, certainly the Declaration. Race, we should be able to see race and it not matter in terms of what you deserve from your government and what we should owe each other and give to each other just as fellow citizens and fellow human beings.
And the point that I would make, we're a year out from the speech, roughly or so from, the Civil Rights Act of 64, and we're out from 1965, where we get the Voting Rights Act to basically have legislation to enforce the 15th Amendment. One of the things I think that should not be lost is that this was part of a march for jobs and freedom. Mm-hmm. And that this is an important period in the civil rights movement where the question of what economic conditions must be in place such that people can pursue happiness in that higher order way that I described earlier. And what we come to see in King, very distinct from all of the other figures that we discussed, in the context of this movement and that moment in 63, is a concern that our economic conditions, in addition to our insistence on discrimination and racism, are out of step with the conditions that need to hold if people are going to remain free, if they're going to be able to pursue happiness, and if they're going to remain equal.
Excellent. Well, I wish this conversation could go on longer, but sadly we are at time here. And so I'll just say, Lucas Morel, Melvin Rogers, for an illuminating discussion that I'm sure our listeners must have absolutely loved. I know I did. I can't thank you enough for joining us here today at America's Town Hall.
Appreciate you inviting us.
It was great to